Greetings. Imagine a state that challenged the mightiest rulers of Mesopotamia, a kingdom whose trade routes stretched from Cyprus to the Persian Gulf. For millennia, they were considered mere legend, a ghost on the pages of history, lost in the sands of Syria. But in the 1960s, a mound named Tel Mardik revealed its secret. What archaeologists found revolutionized our understanding of the ancient world. This is a story about a fire that destroyed a city but preserved its memory. But before we continue, I kindly ask those who haven't done so yet to subscribe to the channel, because only your subscriptions help this channel grow and help me keep my faith that ancient history can be interesting not only to historians. Well, now let's begin. The history of archaeological research in the Near East in the 20th century would be incomplete without mentioning the discovery that fundamentally changed the scientific community's perception of urbanization and statehood in Syria in the 3rd millennium BC. As Paolo Mattiai notes in his fundamental monograph Ebla, an empire rediscovered prior to the start of systematic excavations in 1964, Ebla was known only as a toponym that rarely appeared in Sumerian and Akkadian administrative texts, and its exact location remained a subject of scientific speculation. However, everything changed with the Italian archaeological expedition in Syria, led by Paolo Mattiai. He began work at Tel Mardik, located approximately 55 kilometers southwest of Aleppo, without even suspecting the true scale of the object hidden beneath the ground. The identification of Tel Mardik as ancient Ebla occurred only in 1968, when archaeologists found fragments of a votive statue of King Ebla. On this fragment, an inscription in the Akkadian language was preserved, dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, which became undeniable proof of the city's identity. For Ishtar, his mistress, Ebla, son of Igrish-Hepa, king, dedicated this statue so that it might shine before her. He did this in the 8th year of his reign. The rest of the inscription could not be read, but even so, this discovery became a true turning point, as it confirmed the existence of a powerful West Semitic center. According to Greg Bescher's analysis, this discovery forced scholars to rewrite the history of the region, placing Ebla in the same rank as such giants of the past as Ur, Uruk, and Lagash. And although Kish, Mari, and Byblos are older cities, Ebla can still be boldly classified as one of the first states. But if Ebla wasn't the first, why is there so much noise about it? The thing is, Ebla gave us the first written record of a Semitic language in massive volume. Before this, we knew about Semites only by names in Sumerian texts. Ebla, however, began speaking in full sentences. The language of the texts, now known as Eblate, became a subject of intense scientific debate immediately after its decipherment. The main question lay in its genealogical affiliation within the Semitic language family. Prominent Assyriologists, such as Ignace Gelb and John Huinergaard, reasonably argue the position that the Eblate language belongs to the East Semitic branch, being related to Akkadian. Huinergaard points to the morphological similarity of verb systems and common lexical features that distinguish East Semitic languages from West Semitic ones. Gelb even considered Eblate as the oldest dialect of Akkadian. In contrast to them, the mission's first epigraphist, Giovanni Pettinato, classified Eblate as an old Canaanite language of the West Semitic group, close to Phoenician and Hebrew, relying on lexical parallels and Ebla's geographical location. The modern position is more nuanced. It is believed that the Eblate language is closely related to Akkadian in its grammatical structure, but underwent significant influence from a West Semitic substrate, especially in vocabulary and proper names. Why is this important at all? Well, mainly because through vocabulary, scholars try to establish the origins of the Eblates themselves. And if one adheres to Gelb's theory, according to which the Eblate language is a dialect of Akkadian, then Ebla was simply a Western outpost of the great Mesopotamian culture, rather than something unique. But, as I already said, the hypothesis of Paolo Mattiai and Alfonso Archi now prevails, proving that Ebla was not a copy of Sumer, but was a third great power of the ancient East, a sort of Paleo-Syrian civilization with its own language. In general, the history of ancient Ebla can be divided into three main periods. The first settlement and formation of the city, which took place in 2700 BC, is attributed to the Marduk IIa period. At this time, the foundations of the city's main temples were laid. Specific pottery also appears, indicating its own craft production. And in general, the archaeological stratigraphy of Tel Marduk indicates that at that time, the city already occupied an impressive 50 hectares, which may indicate a second urban revolution in the region. However, the key stage for understanding history is the period of its flourishing, which archaeologists designate as Marduk IIb. It corresponds to the era of the famous royal archives, dating to approximately 2400–2300 BC. The Marduk IIb period was marked by large-scale construction and the development of a complex urban structure, which included the Acropolis, or citadel, and the lower city. The center of the political and economic life of the state was the royal palace. In his work on the royal palace in the Age of the Archives, Paolo Mattiai provides a detailed analysis of the topography of this structure, which was located on the western slope of the Acropolis. The palace complex consisted of several functional zones. First, the Court of Audience, a huge open space where public ceremonies took place. It was here that a podium for the throne was found, from which the king, who bore the title Malachim, addressed his subjects and received foreign ambassadors. Second is the administrative quarter, which included rooms for food storage, various workshops, and officials' offices. The most important room of the palace was the archive room, known by the archaeological code L2769. This is where the main corpus of cuneiform tablets was kept. As researchers described, the tablets were arranged on wooden shelves along the walls. During the catastrophic fire that destroyed the palace, the shelves burned and the tablets fell to the floor. Having been preserved in a sequence close to the original, this allowed scientists to reconstruct the order of their storage. The discovery of the archive itself happened in 1974–75 and became a real sensation. Thousands of tablets dating to the 24th century BC were found. Most of the texts come from the large archive in room L2769, but smaller groups of documents were discovered in other parts of the palace, indicating the bureaucratic specialization of different rooms. Alfonso Archi, the mission's leading epigraphist, classifies the found texts into several main categories. The overwhelming majority, about 90%, are administrative and economic texts. They detail the movement of goods, textiles, metals, and agricultural products. These tablets are effectively the accounting ledgers of the state, registering taxes, tribute, and the issuance of rations. The second group consists of lexical texts, lists of signs and words, including the famous Sumerian Oblate dictionaries. These texts served as a basis for training scribes and testify to the high level of education of the Oblate elite. The third group is significantly smaller in number, but exceptional in importance. These are literary texts, which include hymns, myths, incantations, and proverbs. The fourth group covers diplomatic and legal documents, such as letters, international treaties, specifically the Treaty with Abersal, and royal decrees. The texts are written in cuneiform, borrowed from Mesopotamia. However, Oblate scribes did not simply copy it, but adapted the writing system to the needs of their Semitic language. This required high qualifications. The finding of school exercises testifies to the existence of a scriptorium or school at the palace, where students mastered the complex system of logograms and syllabic signs. Thanks to prosopographical research, it was possible to restore the sequence of the last kings of Ebla before its destruction. Thus, the first king whose reign is reflected in detail in the archives was Igrish Halam. During his time, Ebla was under strong pressure from another state, Mari, and was even forced to pay it tribute. His successor was his son, Irkab Damu. His reign, which lasted about 12 years, became a turning point in the city's history. Ebla freed itself from vassal dependence, reorganized the army, and began an active foreign policy. The last king of the so-called Age of the Archives was Ishar Damu. His long reign, which lasted about 35 years, was characterized by stability and the dominance of powerful viziers at court. An interesting fact is that in Eblate texts, the Sumerian sign En was used to designate the king, which was read as Malachim, whereas the sign Lugal, common for Mesopotamia, in Ebla, designated high officials or governors of subject kings. Relations with the city-state of Mari on the Middle Euphrates were generally the main axis of Ebla's foreign policy. This conflict, which can be called the First 100 Years' War, had deep economic grounds, the struggle for control over trade routes, timber, and metal. Although this trade route did not have a single modern name, historians often call it the Euphrates trade route, which was the main artery of the ancient East. Thus, grain and craft products from southern Mesopotamia were sent along the Euphrates, either west to Byblos or north to the Taurus Mountains. So it turned out that Mari controlled the river. The rulers of Ebla controlled the overland routes and wanted to trade with Sumer directly or dictate their prices, bypassing Mari's customs. So this war was not one of extermination.
It's not personal, Sonny. It's strictly business.
A unique testimony to the diplomatic practice of the 3rd millennium BC is a document known as the Treaty between Ebla and Abersal. This text is the oldest surviving diplomatic treaty in history. The treaty clearly defines zones of influence, listing the cities under its control, which indicates Ebla's dominant position relative to Abersal. Thus, according to this document, Ebla received the right to unimpeded trade and movement along river routes. The text ends with a chilling call to the gods Shamash and Adad to punish the party that violates the agreement. Whoever curses the king or curses the gods shall die. Archaeological finds also confirm Ebla's wide international contacts. Alabaster and diorite vessels, with the names of Egyptian pharaohs, Khafra and Pepi, were found in the palace, indicating direct diplomatic as well as trade exchanges with Egypt. Contacts with the city of Kish in Mesopotamia and the city of Nagar in the Kabur region are also documented. If we talk about the economic model of Ebla itself, it was based on centralized control of resources by the palace. Lucio Milano describes this system as a palace redistribution economy. The palace accumulated resources through taxes and its own farms, and then distributed them in the form of rations for the dependent population and officials. The economy was held not on gold, but on 3 whales that ensured life itself. The first and most important was barley. It was the monthly currency, the basis for bread and beer, without which no worker could survive. Once a year, wool was added to this. Receiving their bundle of wool, a person received not just future clothing, but real capital that could be exchanged for other goods. And of course, oil, the liquid gold of antiquity, which was used for food, in lamps for lighting, and could even be used instead of soap for body care. Of course, not everyone was equal. At the top of the pyramid, the royal family and nobles received not just food, but luxurious banquets with meat and wine. Slightly lower stood the middle class. These were officials and craftsmen who had a stable ration for their families. Men performed the heavy labor, but weavers were the true engine of the economy. Thousands of female weavers worked in palace workshops, creating famous fabrics for export. If we talk about religious life, it was polytheistic and syncretic, combining local Semitic deities with Sumerian and Hurrian elements. Thus, the main patron god was Kura. He is specific to this region and is not found in other major Semitic pantheons. Kura, together with his wife Barama, was considered the divine patron of royal power. Another important figure was Dagon, the god of fertility and grain, who was worshipped in Ebla as the Lord of Canaan. The goddess Ishara and the war god Reshef were also honored. For the inhabitants of ancient Ebla, the death of a king did not become a full stop in the history of his reign. On the contrary, it was merely a transition to a new, higher status. After all, in the imagination of the Eblates, power never belonged exclusively to the living. The living ruler bore the title En, and he was only a temporary administrator, an earthly manager of the state. But as soon as he died, his name and documents received the prefix Dingir, which meant his transformation into a deity. Dead ends became powerful guardian spirits. on whose mood the harvest, victory in war, and the general well-being of the city depended. To ensure this connection, a complex and majestic ritual existed. When a new king ascended the throne, his legitimacy was not confirmed by the signatures of officials or the shouts of the crowd. The real coronation took place in the silence of mausoleums outside the city walls, where the royal couple set off on a ritual journey. They carried generous gifts with them: the finest fabrics, sacrificial sheep, and precious oil to feed the statues of their predecessors. It was a kind of mystical contract. The living pledged to honor and feed the dead, and the dead, in turn, gave the living the right to rule and protected them from misfortunes. In this sacred drama, the queen, or malictum, played an extremely important role. She was not just the ruler's wife, but acted as a high priestess, without whom contact with the afterlife was impossible. During ceremonies, the king and queen personified the divine couple, the god Kura and the goddess Barama, patrons of the royal house. Dressing in ritual robes and repeating the actions of the gods, earthly rulers seemed to merge with their heavenly prototypes, becoming a living bridge between history and the present. Later, already at the final stage, hypogem tombs began to be built literally within the palace itself. Living literally above the heads of one's ancestors was considered the norm and even a necessity. This created a sense of continuity of power. In the throne room, the king was never alone, for beneath his feet, in the darkness of the tombs, those who built this majestic state were always invisibly present. The end of the period of prosperity came suddenly as a result of a brutal assault and fire that turned the palace into ruins. Ironically, it was the fire that baked the clay tablets, preserving them for history. The question of the dating and the culprit of this event is one of the sharpest discussions in archaeology. The Akkadian king Naram Sin, or Naram Suen, grandson of Sargon, boasted in his inscriptions that never before had any king destroyed Armanum and Ebla. This gave grounds for many researchers to initially attribute the destruction to him and date this event to around 2250 BC. However, Paolo Mattiai argues that the destruction happened earlier, around 2300 BC, and links it to the campaigns of Sargon the Great, the founder of the Akkadian Empire, who also claimed the conquest of Ebla. Recent radiocarbon studies of samples from the destruction layer confirm the early date, that is, the range between 2350 and 2300 BC, which makes Sargon the most likely destroyer of the first Ebla. In the 1970s, at the early stage of archive research, epigraphist Giovanni Pettinato made a series of sensational statements that caused a global resonance. He claimed to have found the names of biblical patriarchs in the texts, such as Abraham and Eber, as well as mentions of the cities of the plain. Pettinato also pointed to allegedly monotheistic tendencies in Ebla, citing the change in proper names. However, these statements were carefully checked and refuted by subsequent scientific research. Alfonso Archi proved that the toponyms Pettinato read as Gomorrah are actually other cities in Syria and Mesopotamia. The element Yah in names turned out to be merely a diminutive suffix, not the name of the god Yahweh. And the text interpreted as a creation hymn turned out to be a complex and poorly preserved Sumerian text that is unlikely to have any relation to biblical cosmogony. Today, the scientific consensus is that there is no direct link between Ebla and biblical events, but Ebla provides a unique context for understanding the Semitic world from which biblical traditions later grew. Friends, thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, please like it. If you are not subscribed, please subscribe.